White House. It was a moment the former president describes as bittersweet in his book.
Hello, everybody.
Partly because they were leaving, and partly because of what he thought might happen to the country. You write about Sarah Palin, about her brief ascendancy, and you talk about dark spirits that had long been lurking on the edges of the Republican Party coming center stage. Did you ever think it would get this dark?
No. I thought that there were enough guardrails institutionally that even after Trump was elected, that you would have the so-called Republican establishment who would say, okay, it's a problem if the White House doesn't seem to be concerned about Russian meddling, or it's a problem if we have a president who's saying that neo-Nazis marching in Charlottesville, they're good people on both sides. That's a little bit beyond the pale. And the degree to which we did not see that Republican establishment say, hold on, time out, that's not acceptable, that's not who we are, but rather be cowed into accepting it, and then finally culminating in January 6th, where what originally was, oh, don't worry, this isn't going anywhere, we're just letting Trump and others vent. And then suddenly you now have large portions of an elected Congress going along with the falsehood that there were problems with the election.
And the leadership of the GOP, briefly for one night when they still had the sort of sense of fear in them, going against the president.
And then, poof, suddenly everybody was back in line. Now, the reason for that is because the base believed it. And the base believed it because this had been told to them not just by the president, but by the media that they watch. And nobody stood up and said, stop. This is enough. This is not true. I won't say nobody. Let me correct it. There were some very brave people who did their jobs, like the Secretary of State in Georgia, who was then viciously attacked for it. And all those congressmen started looking around and they said, you know what, I'll lose my job. I'll get voted out of office. Another way of saying this is I didn't expect that there would be so few people who would say, well, I don't mind losing my office because this is too important. America's too important.
Some things are more important than
our democracy is too important. We didn't see that. Now, I'm still the hope and change guy, and so my hope is that the tides will turn, but that does require each of us to understand that this experiment in democracy is not self-executing. It doesn't happen just automatically. It happens because each successive generation says these values, these truths we hold self-evident. This is important. We're going to invest in it and sacrifice for it, and we'll stand up for it, even when it's not politically convenient.
One of the things you write, we need to explain to each other who we are and where we are going. I mean, as somebody who has dedicated myself to storytelling, that really resonates with me, but I wonder, are we as a country still willing to listen to each other's stories?
Well, I think this is the biggest challenge we have, is that we don't have the kinds of shared stories that we used to. Mm. There's always been a division along lines of race, right? We have 400 years of whites and blacks not being able to have shared experiences because of slavery and segregation and so forth. But even within, let's say, the white community, right, the stories of kids who are growing up in Manhattan and the stories of kids who are growing up in Abilene, Texas, and the stories of a kid who's growing up in Montana, those stories no longer meet, partly because of the segment, the siloing of the media, um, the internet, entertainment. We occupy different worlds, and it becomes that much more difficult for us to hear each other, see each other. The thing I learned, first as an organizer and then as an elected official, as a politician, was when you start hearing people's stories, you always find a thread of your own story in somebody else. And the minute that recognition happens, that becomes the basis for a community.
But it does seem like something has changed so that it's become so extreme that we're not even allowing ourselves to get into a position where we can see that commonality. I've heard in the past you talk about when you were starting out in politics, you would go down to southern Illinois to very conservative districts.
Yeah, they give me a hearing.
Right.
Yeah. No, I think that's changed. Part of it is the nationalization of media, the nationalization of politics. The fact is that you used to have a bunch of local newspapers, local TV stations. People weren't having these highly ideological debates, but they were kind of more focused on what's happening day to day. And part of it is also the structure of our economy and our communities. Look, it used to be that a high school, the average high school in America, the average public high school, you would have the banker's kid and the janitor's kid in the same school. And they'd interact, and their parents would be both going to the same football game and would have to know each other. And if it turned out that there was a talented kid of a janitor who also happened to be on the football team, the banker president might say, "Hey, why don't you come work at the bank here?" Because he knew that person. Now we have more economic stratification and segregation. You combine that with racial stratification and the siloing of the media, so you don't have just Walter Cronkite delivering the news, but you have 1,000 different venues. All that has contributed to that sense that we don't have anything in common. And so much of our work is going to have to involve not just policy, but it's also how do we create institutions and occasions in which we can come together and have a conversation.
In Promised Land, you write, our democracy seems to be teetering on the brink of a crisis. Since you wrote that, there was the attack on the Capitol. You got the big lie being pushed continually by not only the former president, but Republicans in Congress.
Right.
Are we still just teetering on the brink, or are we in crisis?
Well, I think we have to worry when one of our major political parties is willing to embrace a way of thinking about our democracy that would be unrecognizable and unacceptable even 5 years ago or a decade ago. When you look at some of the laws that are being passed at the state legislative level, where legislators are basically saying, we're going to take away the certification of election processes from civil servants, secretaries of state, people who are just counting ballots. And we're going to put it in the hands of partisan legislatures who may or may not decide that a state's electoral votes should go to one person or another. And when that's all done against the backdrop of large numbers of Republicans having been convinced wrongly that there was something fishy about the last election, we've got a problem. And this is part of the reason why I think the conversation around voting rights at a national level is important. This is why I think conversations about some of the institutional and structural barriers to our democracy working better, like the elimination of the filibuster or the end to partisan gerrymandering, is important. But this is why it is also important for us to figure out how do we start once again being able to tell a common story about where this country goes. And that is not just the job of politicians, although I think elected officials have an important role. That's where the media is going to have to play an important role. That is where companies have to play an important role. All of us as citizens have to recognize that the path towards an undemocratic America is not going to happen in just one bang. It happens in a series of steps. And when you look at what's happened in places like Hungary and in Poland, that obviously did not have the same traditions, democratic traditions that we did. They weren't as deeply rooted. And yet, as recently as 10 years ago, were functioning democracies, and now essentially have become
democracy doesn't always die in a military coup.
Yes.
Democracy dies at the ballot box.
That's exactly right. And Vladimir Putin gets elected.